Wanted to start with, to give voters who don't know you and wanted to maybe look up this video online. I think this is the hardest job interview question. Describe yourself a little bit and what would you want voters to know about you and why do you want to be mayor?
I've been on the council now for 9 years, and I describe myself as a fiscally responsible, middle-of-the-road uniter divider. I try to maintain sort of a middle ground between people who appear in front of us or between labor and management, to try to listen to both sides, hear all the information or evidence as presented, and try to make a fair and reasonable decision, particularly with regard to labor management issues. And that's helped me establish, I think, credibility and reputation on both sides, both management and labor, to where they think I'm fair and reasonable, and will be of terrific help being able to successfully negotiate reasonable contracts for the city workers within the parameters of our budget and, again, fiscal responsibility. I'm a lifelong Fairbanksan. We have a wonderfully diverse community. I want to help build a better tomorrow for all of us. That is why I went into this public service and why I want to be the city mayor.
You mentioned labor negotiations, and that's one of the subjects I wanted to ask you about. One of the things I've noticed in this campaign is your opponent has criticized you for being too willing to support the labor union side of negotiations, in particular willingness to pay an award if a labor arbitrator sides with the union in a contract dispute. Could you clarify your approach that you would take to labor negotiations?
Certainly. The first thing before you enter into negotiations is there's supposed to be a wage and benefit survey where you look at private industry and you look at other municipalities around Alaska to see what positions are paying. And there are many classifications and positions that you would want to do that for. You obviously don't want to be paying more than you should, but if you're going to attract good people and keep good people, you have to pay a fair wage in terms of what other employers are offering. Unfortunately, my opponent is seriously mischaracterizing my position. I was the chief labor negotiator for the city of Fairbanks starting in 1995. And I think if you ask anybody who was involved, they would tell you I represented management in a very zealous and a very tough but fair fashion. The law says you're supposed to sit down in good faith with an open mind and try to reach agreement on wages, hours, terms, and conditions of employment. And if you can't do that, then usually you go to mediation or arbitration. And if you end up in arbitration, and let's say the arbitrator's award is not to your liking, well, then we need to look at it. We need to keep fiscal responsibility in mind, but we also, on the other hand, have to be able to fairly reward and motivate our workforce. It is a serious mistake on the part of my opponent or anybody else before they're even mayor to be telegraphing the possibility of non-funding. And so I intend to sit down with an open mind. I understand both sides. I understand management and fiscal responsibilities, but I also understand that employees need to be recognized, rewarded, and valued. I've been working in HR and employment for more than 20 years. And to send a message, the threat or implied threat of non-funding is demoralizing. It could be viewed as bad faith or an unfair labor practice. And it's just not the way to set out to try to successfully deal with your unionized workforce.
You mentioned your work experience as a former labor negotiator for the city, and you currently work as an attorney for TCC, and you also do mediation and arbitration.
Yes.
Are those things that you'd want to, the current mayor has maintained his business in town while serving as mayor. Do you think you'd continue that if if elected?
Well, the mayor's position is a full-time position, and that of course would be my first and most important focus. I also teach at the University of Alaska
Forgot to mention
and
that.
the Community and Technical College. And 2 of my courses are online courses, and 1 is going to be on Saturdays, so that would not cause any interference with the mayor's job. So obviously I would have to cut back, and I could not do something that might be viewed as some sort of conflict of interest. And so it may be I would not be able to continue with arbitration and mediation work, at least in Alaska. But we'll sort of cross that bridge when we get to it after October 1.
Sounds good.
I'm very, part of my job for 9 years at Tanana Chiefs and at Fairbanks Native Association before that, and part of what I teach at the university is ethics and corporate responsibility. And I have very high ethical standards. And I'm not going to do anything that creates conflict of interest or might be viewed as unethical. So make sure any of my outside business activities don't pose any problem of that sort.
Wanted to ask you, one of the issues you hear about from time to time in city council meetings is chronic inebriates, especially in the downtown Fairbanks area. Do you think there's any policies that the Fairbanks city government should, any new programs or steps the city should be taking?
The chronic inebriate problem is one piece of a big puzzle. Alcoholism is a disease. And so if we have chronic inebriates and you couple that with homelessness, we have people with a serious disease, sometimes homeless, which compounds things. And there are a number of things and programs we need to keep in mind. We've got the enhanced detoxification facility, which we need to make sure that's being fully utilized. You have substance abuse programs. Fairbanks Native Association, Ralph Purdue Center, Tanana Chiefs has substance abuse programs. We've got the Housing First, the housing for chronic inebriates, which opened a short while back. There's some discussion of the possibility of seeking to expand that program. It's having some terrific success stories, to my understanding. And so one of the things that would be necessary also is to sit down with the community partners. And this is an area where I have a lot of experience, and in fact also teach a course called Establishing Effective Community Partnerships. Sit down with maybe the substance abuse and mental health programs and people, the Downtown Association and others who are involved with particularly the downtown area, and discuss this. What can we do to address this problem? And we need to be sensitive and we need to be careful. We don't want to, for example, be seen as possibly picking on one particular ethnic group or diversity group, and so we have to be tactful and we have to be respectful as we try to approach this problem of a disease. But to the extent that I've heard people say, a number of people, they don't feel comfortable, for example, downtown sometimes, or on the bike paths or elsewhere, or they feel they've been verbally abused by some of these people, and we need to address that. That sort of conduct is not acceptable. And I will, with the community groups, sit down and ask 3 questions. How do we make Fairbanks safer? How do we make it cleaner? And how do we improve the economy? And part of making it safer is to address this issue, which we also want to avoid situations where we've had chronic inebriates and others freeze to death in our community in the winter, or some of the homeless people. So it's a difficult issue, and there's no quick solution or magic recipe. Youth homelessness ties into it also. But the city has been involved in a community development block grant to get the homeless youth shelter started, and that again will also be very important and helpful.
Let me get a little more specific on this one. You mentioned talking to different groups, and that always seems like a good idea. And you mentioned Housing First, maybe expanding. Do you think the city should take a direct role in that? That's a TCC program, right?
It is a TCC program. I don't know that the city would need to or would want to take a direct role. I mean, to some extent, the city's always got an indirect role in any program like that in terms of if they need security help or if they need a police response, or the Community Service Patrol, of course, at times has to help residents return there since that's where they live. And the city is involved to some extent in funding the Community Service Patrol. One of the things I'd like to see is the patrol area expanded for the Community Service Patrol. It used to be bigger than it is. It sort of shrunk down. And to give you an example of where it seems a bit ridiculous, at times in our building, in our Chief Peter John Tribal building, one day there was a person down, appeared to be inebriated, but our building's right across Hall Street, so that was just outside CSP's patrol area, so to my understanding the city police had to be called. And so I'd like to see CSP expand. It's certainly a lot lower cost program than using police officers. And many of the calls, maybe most of the calls, are medical type calls. They're not police calls. And so another possibility, and I believe because of my good relationship with both management and labor, I'd like to talk to our fire union about can we somehow get the firefighters more involved with CSP to where if there's need for a response, you don't have to call a police officer first, and free up our police to do more police work. It's incredibly frustrating to citizens I've talked to when they can't get a police officer to respond to certain types of calls or thefts or hit and runs of the perpetrators, not there anymore, things like that. So this whole area of improved public safety, including the chronic inebriate problem, is one I want to. That's my first priority if you see the little brochure I put out.
And let me ask you something I've heard you bring up in one of the debates. You talked about creating a kind of diversity council to help different racial minorities and other minority groups get a voice in the city. Any idea of what this council would entail?
Somebody mentioned to me, and I didn't realize this, but the borough apparently used to have a diversity council. I'm not sure exactly what it was called. And a name was mentioned of somebody who apparently used to be involved. So one of the things I want to do if I'm elected is talk to that person to see how that council functioned, how often it met, whether it had rules and procedures or bylaws, things like that. And I want to involve the city council, obviously, as much as possible in any of these sort of issues. And so what I had in mind, as you've stated, is I think some of the diversity groups in our community have at times not felt as included, or that their voice and concerns are not heard as much as they could be or should be. And so I want to have a representative or liaison, say from the Alaska Native community, the African American community, the Latinos, the Asians, perhaps a youth representative, just to make sure we're hearing all the concerns. As I walk to different neighborhoods, I've heard concerns expressed, and at times by members of diversity groups, things that concern me. And I want to make sure we pull our community together as best we can. That's the basis of the slogan for my campaign, which is Stronger Together. We are a diverse, multicultural community. A lot of diversity, a lot of differences of all sorts, but we work best when we work together. And that makes us stronger as a community.
With the winter coming on, I think it's good to talk about air quality, and I know that's been to some extent a borough issue, to some extent a state issue. Is there anything additional you think the city of Fairbanks should be doing about air quality?
Well, we banned installing any new hydronic heaters a number of years ago, so we actually, I think, had a jump on the borough a significant period of time. At that time, it seems like I recall we were told there were about 20 in the city. We're now led to think there are fewer than that. And a while back, we passed an ordinance or resolution so that the ones that are still in the city could be upgraded to be more efficient, hopefully to burn more cleanly. So that's one thing. The second issue is we have 2 seats on that natural gas utilities board, which of course was formed by the 3 governments coming together and the city of North Pole and Fairbanks transferring their utilities power. I've been a little surprised because I've asked a couple of times at council meetings for status reports, and the mayor indicated he wasn't regularly attending those meetings, and so I asked if he had a staff person who was doing so, and the answer was no. Although I was told, oh, we have 2 representatives on the board, at which point I asked, well, are we getting regular reports? And the answer seemed to be no. So when I'm elected mayor, I'm going to become actively involved in following that board, making sure I know fully what's happening, advocating where required, pushing that project. I testified before the Regulatory Commission a few weeks ago and talked about the importance of this project. Energy costs are causing a lot of problems for everybody here. People are using a lot of wood instead because they're trying to heat cheaper, which is understandable, but it's creating a terrible pollution problem. So we need that large-scale natural gas as fast as possible. And as a byproduct will also be propane, which could help our outlying rural communities, which are paying even higher fuel costs. Some of the villages, town-on-cheap villages, $8, $9, $10 a gallon for fuel. So I guess those are the 2 main things. The borough's hands are, somewhat tied in view of what the citizens voted, and so the state or the federal government are going to probably have to take the reins for the most part. If anybody has any ideas as to whether the city can do anything more, I'd certainly like to hear that.
Sounds good, John. Well, that's about all the time we've got for what we're hoping to do with this interview. I appreciate you coming in. Like I think one of the moderators said at one of the debates a few days back, thanks for being out there and being willing to put a target on your back and be a candidate.
Thanks
Take
very
care.
much.
And see you election night.